Oh, hi. This is Greg Harding, and welcome to the video blog. I've had a question in today from Darren Atherton, and he said, can you explain depth of field, the choosing and using of it? So thanks very much for the question. Now, depth of field is a very popular question, and it just relates to the aperture choice that you use for your camera. So a very wide aperture would be something like a 1.2, or a very small aperture would be something like f/22 typically on your camera. And all that does is very simply it chooses how much of your image is going to be in focus. So for example, if you were photographing a person and they were next to a background or had a background behind them, if you choose a very wide aperture, something like a 2.8, it's going to knock the background out of focus. So if, for example, I don't know what the camera's set to at the moment, but if I drift out of shot, I become blurred, and if I come back in, then I'm sharp again. So that is a very simple example about depth of field, and it's to do with the depth of focus. Typically, if you're looking for a general use aperture that you don't have to worry too much about, then I would set your camera to something like f/8. And there was a big rule of thumb years and years ago by professionals using plate cameras. They used to say f/8 and be there, and that's basically because if you put it at f/8, the lenses are pretty much designed as that being the optimum middle aperture for use, and that will provide you with a very comfortable depth of focus. So, but if you're looking, for example, in landscape photography, you might want a very large depth of field, so something that takes into consideration the foreground being very sharp and the background remaining sharp. So you would use something like f/22, f/32 for that. But there's always a trade-off. If you use a shallow depth of field, which is something like 1.2, 2.8, something like that, you have a very limited amount of depth that the camera will remain sharp for you. But what will happen is that your shutter speeds, you'll be able to climb up, so you'll be able to handhold. But if you have a very big depth of field, f/22, then your shutter speed will come down, and so you'll have to use it on a tripod. So there's I won't go into exposure because exposure is something completely different, but there's ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, and they control what is perceived to be the correct exposure. And using any combination of those three, you can choose how you want your depth of field, how fast or slow you want your shutter, and whether or not you're working in dark or bright rooms. So I hope that goes some way to explaining depth of field. Thanks very much for your question, and if you've got any other questions, then pop them in below and I'll get to you soon. Thanks very much.